to us today from the Gospel of Matthew, where we are continuing to hear Jesus deliver what is known as his Sermon on the Mount. Last week we heard about Jesus talking about the Beatitudes, and we talked about God's wisdom that comes and calls us to lead wise guy lives filled with God's wisdom as opposed to worldly wisdom. So today we kind of continue where Jesus was at, and he brings to us today some metaphors, some things that are just hopefully powerfully filled pieces that help us connect. Does anybody know what I got here?
Salt.
Salt, yeah. So I'm going to invite you to take a pearl of salt. Maybe it may be your pearl of wisdom today. I think Emmerich's a little bit easier to keep from getting one of these than maybe Odin would be. So Odin would knock me over and want to take one. So I really got one. But take one for yourself and Emmerich if you want to. But I just didn't want him to be surprised by the bitterness of the salt. What do you know about salt when you have it? Is salt good?
Yes, you need it.
You need it for sure. Salt can be good, right? I mean, I can't picture bacon without salt, right? A variety of things remind us that, or help with salt, right? That flavors are brought out and things are...
keep our meats before refrigeration without salt.
Exactly. For preservation, salt is important as well. Our bodies need it. In some research I was doing, it looks like there are over 14,000 uses of salt in our world today, known uses. We need it, is said, for the body to function. It's used in fixing dye as well as cleaning things out of cloth. It was used to make leather. It's used in the industry, all kinds of industries, but particularly to help form plastics. So just think what life would be like if there weren't toys for little ones, right? It's all kinds of people. You see, he's already screaming because just that thought. Over 1,000 years ago, to start domesticating animals, dogs particularly, people would put out salt. And they would attract the animals, and that's kind of how they started getting them to be in homes. Anybody know the expression, be worth your salt? You know, heard that? It comes from the custom that Roman soldiers were paid often with salt, or they used the salt as a commodity to buy equipment and whatnot. And so you had to live up to that payment. The word salary also comes from what is now, turns into the word salt. Salary, salt, it's some kind of Latin jump through hoops. All that's to say, salt is important. And I think Jesus is saying to us in our text, which I didn't even read yet, did I? Well, I'll get to it here in a second. Jesus wants us to hear this. Let me tell you why you are here. He even says that right out loud. You are here as salt seasoning that brings the God flavors of this earth. This comes from the Message Bible, by the way. It has a little bit different flavoring for us. If you lose your saltiness, how will people taste godliness? If you've lost your usefulness, you'll end up in the garbage. So here's another way to put it. You are light, bringing out the God colors in the world. God is not a secret to be kept. We're going public with this. As public as a city on a hill. light bearers, you don't think I'm going to hide you under a basket, do you? I'm putting you on a light stand. Now, if you've been put there on a hilltop, on a light stand, shine. Keep open house. Be generous with your lives. By opening up to others, you'll prompt others to be to open up with God, the generous Father in heaven. Jesus says, don't suppose for a minute that I've come to demolish the scriptures, either God's law or the prophets. I'm not here to demolish, but to complete. I'm going to put it all together in a vast panorama. God's law is more real and lasting than the stars in the sky and the ground at your feet. Long after the stars burn out and the earth wears out, God's law will be alive and working. But trivialize even the smallest item, like that salt pellet, in God's law, and you will only have trivialized yourself. But take it seriously. Show the way for others, and you will find honor in the kingdom. Unless you do far better in the Pharisees in matters of right living, you won't know the first thing about entering the kingdom. This is the gospel of our Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So, Jesus says to us, you are the salt of the earth. And I'm going to stop with our text really there because we talk an awful lot in Epiphany about light. And I wanted to focus on this piece about being salt. Particularly because I think in our 21st century throwaway culture of plenty, that we take household goods such as salt, flour, other things, but salt with a grain of salt. We take it for granted. But as Mark Kuransky says in his book called Salt, A History of the World, or a World's History, from the beginning of civilization until about 100 years ago, he said, salt was one of the most sought-after commodities in our human history. So for such things that we some already named, the ancients believed that salt would ward off evil powers. In Leviticus, in the Bible, salt was required as part of the offering, the grain offering that was brought to the temple. And religious covenants, kind of like we use a wax seal in later times, salt was used in signing covenants with God and with governments. Salt is used for medicinal purposes. It disinfects wounds, it checks bleeding, it stimulates thirst, it treats skin diseases. We talked about the idea of celery. It was used in food preservation. Now it's used to de-ice roads, right? All kinds of things. And in cooking. Does anybody cook without salt? I mean, some of us have to for health reasons, and we want to honor that. But we like flavoring, right? We like the idea that when we're going to eat, that there is this sense of purpose to what we're doing, a sense of taste. And salt accentuates flavors. It brings out the best in what it is we're eating. But there are downsides to salt. We just mentioned one in health matters. It burns too, right? Too much salt, as well as not enough salt, can be deadly for us as human beings.
We see what it does to our cars.
Yeah, it eats away at our cars. Yeah,
Metal.
Sidewalks, metal, all kinds of stuff. Clothing, shoes. Yeah, it can be a ruiner too. I mean, not just did it help cure leather back in the old days to make it soft, it's on its way to ruining it, right? If you leave it there. So, and just like ruining anything, I can push this salt metaphor probably too far. So I'll be careful about that. But any good thing has its limits. But I want Jesus tells us, calls us, his listeners, that we are the salt of the earth. I think he's saying something profound, and I don't want us to miss it. First off, I think he's telling us, and I hope we really hear, that we are salt. We're not just supposed to be salt, or to become it after trying really hard, or that there's some promise out there that we will, and God will love us more if we do all the right things. The language that Jesus uses tells us that we are already 100% salt. It's descriptive. It tells us it's our statement of identity. It is in our DNA. So we are that which will either enhance or embitter, soothe or irritate, melt or sting, preserve or ruin. For better or for worse, we are the salt of the earth. And what we do with our saltiness matters. It can matter a lot. Whether we want to or not, whether we notice or not, whether we're intentional about it or not, we spiritually impact this world that we live in. Hence those pieces of paper that I gave out earlier. I want us to be aware that spiritually we make an impact. What we say matters. What we do matters. It shows that we are living salty lives. Second, we are precious. Again, it's easy, I think, to miss the import of this in our very modern world where it's cheap, salt is cheap and plentiful. But imagine what Jesus' first followers would have heard when he called them salt. Remember, this sermon took place on the mount where he was talking to the poor and the mournful, the outcasts, the meek, the persecuted, those who were hungry and sick and crippled and thirsty and frightened. He told them, you are the salt of the earth. You who have not cleaned up or are shiny, you who are not well-fed or fashionable, you who are rejected and wounded and unloved and forgotten, you are the salt of the earth. You are essential. You are worthwhile. You are treasured. And I am commissioning you. For all that we've spent trying to earn our way into divine favor, believing that our goodness, our piety, might someday make us precious to God, I hope this metaphor stops us in our tracks and reminds us we are that right now. Jesus knowingly named a commodity that was priceless in his time and place. And he conferred great value on those who did not consider themselves valuable. He's still doing this right now for you. You are the salt of the earth. Don't let someone else take away that import from you. You and I stand in the crowd, and we are one of them. And we've come today to hear and listen and be a part, to know that Jesus is going to heal and have our lives put back together. That we come in search of meaning and direction and purpose, and Jesus' words can be true and applicable today as they were 2,000 years ago. Third, salt does its best work when it is poured out, sprinkled everywhere, when it's scattered, when it dissolves into what is around it. Think about how salt enhances food. It was a fine art that my grandmother did not possess. She dumped, instead of sugar into a pie recipe, she used salt, ruining the pies. And that's what happens. Too little, however, and food becomes kind of bland and tasteless. Too much and it's overpowered. And food loses its layers and complexity and becomes a sharp bitterness of mess. Salt isn't meant to cluster. It's meant to give of itself. It's meant to share its unique flavor in order to bring out the best in all that it surrounds. Which means that if we want to enliven or enhance or deepen or preserve this world in which we live in, we shouldn't hide in the walls of our churches. We must not cluster and congregate simply for our own comfort. We must not retreat into our own coffee clutches out of fear or cynicism or selfishness or righteousness. Salt doesn't exist to preserve itself. It exists to preserve the other. Another metaphor that might be helpful for this is the metaphor Jesus used all the time, dying. Jesus calls us to die to self, to die in order to live. So remember that we are salt. It's not a question of striving to become what we aren't. It's a question of living into the precious fullness of what we already are. And lastly, salt is meant to enhance, not dominate. And Christian saltiness heals. It doesn't wound. It purifies. It doesn't infect. It softens. It doesn't destroy. Even when Christian saltiness has an edge, which sometimes preaching does, sometimes our own witness does. For example, it incites thirst. It only draws the thirsty toward the living water of God. It doesn't leave the already thirsty, parched, and dehydrated, and embittered. One of the great tragedies, I think, or consequentially big sins of historic Christianity is our failure to understand the distinction. Salt fails when it dominates. Instead of eliciting goodness, it destroys the potential of all around it. Salt poured out without discretion or direction can leave a burnt sense, a bitter sensation in its wake. It ruins rather than enhances. It repels. And unfortunately, I think that's some of the reputation that Christianity, all of us, has developed today. It's known as exacerbating and wounding and irritating rather than providing goodness and hope and soothing souls. We're considered often domineering and arrogant. Well, we should not hoard our power. We should be giving it away. We should be using our words to heal and not burn. Jesus never intended any of that when he called us the salt of the earth. Our preciousness was never meant to make us proud and self-righteous. It was meant to humble and awe us. Our vocation in these times and places, I think, it's especially important not to lose our saltiness. We might think that's the first thing that should go in conversation with others. But it's this important saltiness that Jesus is talking about today that I think is so required. Don't retreat. That's our temptation. Don't hide. Don't choose blandness instead of boldness. Let us keep our love for Jesus out there, not a hushed secret. What Jesus is talking about here is making a difference for others in this world. Excuse me, so we can be a tastiness for the world around us. So I want to give just a couple of examples of what this might look like before I start to either cough or lose you entirely. one simple thing, it might be looking in the eyes of another person and speaking a kind word, an uplifting and positive sense, an affirmation. Maybe even to a person that you might not otherwise want to say something nice to. Maybe it's acknowledging that they are in the image of God, and instead of labeling them as other and dismissing them, see God in the eyes of another. It's using your generosity with compassion in your time and money to care for and make difference in the lives of other people, particularly the poor and hungry or the homeless. It's starting conversations and rebuilding relationships with perhaps those you have total indifference toward. It's praying that God would bless with all the good gifts that you hope for yourself to other people whom you would often think of withholding from, perhaps those you disagree with. The prophet Isaiah speaks of loosing the bonds of injustice and letting the oppressed go free. So maybe salt looks like politics that are not dependent on control and power, but are more about equality and diversity and recognizing the dignity of every human being. Salt is faithfulness and commitment to others shown by listening and being available and spending time. It's about slowing down and rearranging a schedule and valuing presence over efficiency and productivity. It's choosing a life that is self-giving rather than taking and acquiring, vulnerability rather than defensiveness, and intimacy rather than isolation. And it means that we will get hurt. It's loving a neighbor, an enemy, and yourself. It means choice overcoming feelings. Salt best sustains and enriches life, and it's poured out with discretion in God's kingdom so it might be known on earth. A kingdom of spice and zest, a kingdom of health and wholeness, a kingdom of value, varied depth, flavor, and complexity. You are the salt of the earth. Be salt. Amen.